wider, so you participate in that?
Yes.
Yes. And do you know, it may be a question for the applicant, if the current managers of the subject property that's proposed for subdivision are part of that?
Not to my knowledge.
Not part of it.
Not to my knowledge, but could be, but not to my knowledge.
Thank you. I think that was all for me. Thank you.
You know, I have no questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for coming. I think it's very important that you see a copy of that suggested condition.
Yes.
And
I was busy on the council all day yesterday with my daughter-in-law, so
yes, oh no,
many emails.
yes, we can understand that. It didn't come to us until yesterday morning, so staff have done their best to get the message out to everyone. It is only a draft
Yes.
at this stage, but it you may find it useful and it could be helpful if you have any comments. I'm not quite sure what process you'd have to do for comments, but
Well, in particular, I think because some of the discussion yesterday was around whether the definition, I think the term is agricultural management that's being used in there. And we were wondering, and there was some discussion around whether that term covers the existing activities, including activities on your property that are occurring. So we'd probably be interested to hear if you thought that was the case, or if there was some further, there was some suggestion from the applicant that perhaps some further clarification that the intention is that condition applies to all existing activities, including the likes of dairying and other farming activities.
I'm just trying to, I don't know, Mr. Lawson, have you got some idea on how we might be able to get any comments to you and you know, from Mr. Davidson and others?
I've got a suggestion, and as I said yesterday, the no complaints covenant was intentionally general and broad, and by specifying the activities undertaken by Mr. Apple specifying those activities, it's notionally narrowed it or focused it on one particular industry. So I think that there's a danger in becoming too prescriptive in the definition of, because then what if you've missed something out? I'd rather keep it general. And what I had thought of is that where Mr. Apple has introduced the bits about, well, that was in the original draft, farm machinery, the operation of bird scarers, frost fans, and other similar activities, just add in there, and stock management practices associated with pastoral farming, and perhaps pastoral farming and cropping activities. It was intended to be broad to cover everything.
Yeah, I think that the issue that term agricultural management to me seems somewhat limiting. So I understand your intent. My suggestion would simply be that farming and agricultural management might be the way to, if your intention is to keep it broad.
That might be a better way of
right. I agree. I think that those the stock probably needs to be in there, given the
and if we, I mean, the intention is to not have not have the residents in the subdivision being able to hinder farming activities. So that's the intention, and it's just a matter of making sure that by trying to do that, we don't leave a door open for someone to complain about one particular activity. So I'm intending to try and wordsmith that in the right of reply. And the other thing that Mr. Davidson's raised is the noise from harvesting, and we've had a couple of submitters raise that. That's exempt from noise standards, so they're not. It's basically that there are no noise standards for temporary harvesting and machinery under both the existing plan and the proposed plan. So. I don't think that we need to go into specifics about things like noise, because it's covered in the plan, but it's also covered in the generalisation of this is a standard agricultural, horticultural practice.
And the point is, and I'm saying this for Mr. Davidson's benefit, the idea would be that this would be on the actual what document is it?
Well, it gets registered on the title. So when you talk about people coming to to here, they come knowing because it's registered on the title, that the no complaints covenant is registered on the title.
That's right.
So they know that it's that they can't complain about not knowing it. They're deemed to have knowledge even if they didn't have actual knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation.
I'm oh, sorry, no,
Yes,
no,
you've
I
got a
don't
question, Ms. Lambert?
actually have a question. Well, it might end up being one, but I mean, to me, this whole issue that Mr. Davidson's raised and other submitters is really around that, right to farm and to be able to carry on farming. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Lawson, if there's certainly wouldn't be a consent condition, that's for sure, but some kind of possibility of a statement provided to owners or potential owners that they are moving into a working rural area. It's really a no surprises for people who may not have ever lived in those places before.
That's very much the purpose of the no complaints covenant being registered. The problem with having a sort of a side statement that is given out and as part of the sales of sections in the subdivision by the applicant is it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to who buys subsequently is going to have the same thing. So that's the beauty of having it registered. It's more about making sure that the no complaints covenant is clear and well understood. And so, I mean, it's a matter that now under the Real Estate Agents Act, now they have to disclose anything known about the property. That should include that this is that there is a no complaints covenant. You'll come into the country.
Okay, thank you.
Just one more, sorry, just a further question that I thought of, Mr. Davidson, after my first question. Is there, with the catchment collective stuff in your farm plan, is there some monitoring that goes on in that stream?
Yes, there's ongoing monitoring.
Ongoing, yeah, and that's undertaken, is that undertaken by you or is that regional council does that? Does that monitoring? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. No further questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Davidson, for coming. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Input very much.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Well, that's the end of the submitters. Mr. Lawson, I just in my drive last night and this morning, 30 minutes or so gives you time to think about lots of things about the country. And I had one further question that I wondered whether I could ask. Hey. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Mr. Kay, in another life of mine, probably 10, 15 years ago, I was involved in something called HPUTS, which was the Heritonga Plains Urban Development Strategy, which was designed to look at the question of housing in the Heritonga Plains needs for the future. And the councils of the Heritonga Plains got together and managed to work out certain areas that indeed would be the places where future development would go. Of course, at that time, Central Hawke's Bay wasn't part, the council wasn't part of that. But I'm wondering whether, is there a similar strategy or in order to do the plan, presumably the proposed plan, presumably there's been some discussion on housing needs and where residential development could go in the future, has there?
I guess that's part of the district council's replacement
Yes.
plan. We haven't been involved in
No.
seeing that discussion. We know that the council here is facing infrastructure challenges in their suburban areas. So even land that's zoned is still constrained. So, it's not just a challenge of where we want to put things, it's actually accommodating development where we've got it zoned already is a significant challenge for the council and for developers. So returning, no, I'm not aware of, wasn't involved in any of that strategy. But I, like you, expect that it has fed into, there has been base work that's fed into the district plan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Lawson, for allowing me to ask that question. I guess that's a question perhaps Mr. Mackay might be able to answer. in his report later. Right, well, we're about to start actually, actually, Mr. Mackay. 2 minutes stop. 2 minutes stop. 2 minutes stop. Thank you very much, Ms. Green, for managing to help us get the submitters together this morning.
Oh,
It's
you're
very
right,
helpful. Council. And we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I assume that I can take it take the report as read, and what I propose to do is to just go through, just highlight a couple of things from the report and points that have come up during the course of the hearing, and then if you could answer questions from yourselves. So the last two things that we just discussed, the no complaints covenants and the issue of strategic planning and population growth are two matters that I was wanting to cover. But I'll just try and keep to the logical order that I've got in my notes, so they'll sort of come at the end.
Thank you.
And so I just wanted to start just by referring to page 17 in paragraph 36 of the 42A report. And it's just around the dates and timing. So the application was received, as has been said, on the 19th of April 2021, and the proposed Central Hawke's Bay District Plan was publicly notified on the 28th of May 2021. And I have noticed that I have got an error in paragraph 254 of my report where I somehow mixed up the date that the plan was notified and mentioned an October date, but it was definitely the 28th of May 2021.
Perhaps was that where Mr. Kay, I believe in your evidence, you refer to that October date. That may have come from there.
That's Mr. Lawson.
It was in my submissions.
Yeah, right, in submissions.
So possibly from my era to start with.
Thank
I mean, the main point on it was obviously that the application was lodged prior to the proposed plan being notified, so that's clear. It's just about the timing of when that was notified. Just go to page 40.
Sorry, Mr. McKay, just on the website says it was notified on the 19th of October 2021.
It might be where I got that date. I wonder if that was a further submissions date, because the actual notification date was May.
Sorry, I appreciate our website is not easy to navigate at times, but it's definitely 20th May. I can send you the link if you like, where the full timeline is there and the timeline for the proposed hearings going forward.
That's where I've got it from, and I cross-referenced it.
I suspect that's where my paragraph 254 came from, but that could well have been the notification of the further submissions. I'd now like to move to page 47. The issue of street lighting. In fact, page 46, paragraph 107. So that just summarises what's already been said, that the recommendation in the report is to apply full street lighting based on the recommendation of Stantec. And the applicants raise concerns with rural amenity and the desire to keep a low level of lighting and therefore not to light the full subdivision. So subsequent to the report, we have had some advice from Ian Campbell of Stantec, who's a senior electrical engineer, and he specialises in street lighting. And I have got some correspondence that I'd like to table from Mr. Campbell, in which he essentially confirms that the condition recommended is appropriate in his opinion. And the reason why he says that is that because the various engineering standards for street lighting, they have all sorts of different categories with quite strong lighting required on arterial roads or intersections, down to what he calls category P lighting, which is referenced in a Australian New Zealand standard. And he explains in here that it's basically quite a low level of lighting, really just enough for basically traffic safety and pedestrian safety that you would expect in an area of reasonably close subdivision and development. So I'll just read from his advice here. I don't believe that this development, if provided with full category P lighting, will cause any suburban glow, upward waste light, or issues to passing vehicles on State Highway 50. The applicable design standard, which is AS NZS 1158.3 2020, also requires glare control to a specified level, limitation of spill light beyond the road reserve, and upward waste light, sky glow. As that condition's been expressed in this set of recommended conditions, it's quite a general condition which basically allows the detail of the street lighting to be worked through with the other engineering design details in the 224 approval stage. And Mr. Campbell's advice was that was an appropriate way to deal with it, and that through their engineering design, the expectation would be that the full category P lighting would be required as part of that. So Mr. Campbell has made himself available via the remote access teams if you would like to ask questions of him in relation to that.
I just wouldn't mind asking Mr. Mackay. So are you satisfied then that the concerns that have been expressed around potential light pollution will be sort of minimised or completely mitigated by this condition?
I'm satisfied that this condition is appropriate. I was a little bit concerned with the original traffic engineering advice that we had, that it was fair minutes in the advice that street lighting should be required for a traffic safety issue. But there wasn't much explanation to that, as I think Mr. Kay pointed out in his evidence. And so when discussing it in this report, I did leave it. Well, basically invited the applicants to expand on that at the hearing, which they have done. But in the meantime, after talking to Mr. Campbell, I am satisfied that it is appropriate, because this category P lighting is a low level, essentially soft lighting, which is enough for traffic safety, and in a situation where there are footpaths on one side of the road, even though they might not be commonly frequented at night. And that's Mr. Campbell's advice. He's actually based in I think in Christchurch. So he does do quite a lot of work in lifestyle subdivisions in the South Island. So he was comparing this application to, for example, Queenstown Lakes, where there are quite a lot of developments outside the urban areas, and he said it's that type of category P lighting, although there are instances there where there might be no lighting, but he gave various examples. And I'm not sure actually if we had got enough coffee.
Oh, no, sorry, I can grab some more. Sorry, do you mind?
Well, Mr. Mackay, I mean, you don't want to change the suggested condition to actually specify
That was
category
my
P.
question.
Well, that was
The
Miss.
applicant to-
Yes, well, that was Mr. Campbell's advice that the suggested condition is actually appropriate. If I just look at the condition.
Sufficient to ensure the safety of road intersection.
It does appear safety focused to me rather than, there's no mention of amenity, but I'm assuming that comes in through standard from what you're.
Yes, that's the purpose of it, is the safety aspect.
That we don't need to actually reference it, whether category P, but we don't need to reference the standard. What's the advice?
Well, there could be a note put under the condition, but Mr. Campbell's advice was that the way the condition was worded, it's typically something that's worked through between the developer in the council and the detail engineering plan design. In this case, because there is some contention there, that could be specified. Yeah, so condition 22 is the one that talks about the full roading design approval. So a cross reference to that in conditions, recommended conditions 33 and 34. So in that instance, if there was to be anything specified, it would be probably in condition 33. Okay, so that was the street lighting issue. Aside from the new sensitivity, no complaints, which I'll come to, the other condition or issue rather, it's in contention in terms of the conditions is the effluent disposal and the potential for cumulative adverse effects. And one of the matters that Mr. Freeman's raised, and it's also been in the advice from Paddle Delamore to the council, is about the cutting and carrying of grass. So as per the recommended conditions, the proposed consent notice didn't go as far as mentioning that. It is something that the applicant has offered, so it could go into the condition. The reason that I didn't recommend it originally was just on council's ability to monitor and enforce and the practicality of that in a lifestyle subdivision situation, of getting people to use a catcher and mowing their lawns and then dispose of the grass appropriately. So Alabome is with us at the moment and will be available for questioning along with Hilary Luff. So I understand their advice was the cut and carry, it should be off-site, but perhaps if Ella can just confirm that when you talk to her. So in terms of the practicality of that, it would obviously be easier if the grass could just be composted on site, which I think was suggested by Mr. Cook. So I've in terms of my recommended condition.
So what number is that again? Yeah, so that's condition 49. So as it stands at the moment, it talks about a consent notice on every title, stating any application for building consent for a habitable building will include an on-site wastewater treatment system that incorporates UV treatment and drip line irrigation. Maintenance of the system and shall be carried out in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications. The N is not meant to be there, is it?
Yes, no, that's right.
The system shall be carried out.
That's right. So the system shall be carried out. Thank you. So between those two sentences, a cut and carry requirement could be added in. I think the concern still stands that it is unrealistic to expect the district council would be able to monitor and enforce such a condition. Therefore, the reason for putting it in would be to anticipate that a certain percentage of residents will want to be seen to be doing the right thing, and basically comply without monitoring and enforcement. If enough people do that, it may assist with the cumulative adverse effect issue, which is something that I suggest question Ms. Bohm about. But that's pretty much all I can really add on that issue. So what I had in the report still stands, that jurisdictionally discharges to the environment are a regional council issue. In terms of the management of integrated effects, it obviously does relate to this subdivision, but it's not something that the district council has expertise or responsibility for, aside from its function in approving building consent applications, whereas signing off to appropriate plumbing and drainage, including wastewater connections, happens at building consent stage. If a wastewater connection or proposed wastewater system at that stage required regional council consent, well, then that would be required prior to the building consent.
Well,
We understand it doesn't, sorry.
So is it appropriate now then for Ms. Bowman, Ms. Lough?
Yes, it probably is.
Could I just ask a question about the consent notice stuff first, actually, and it'll be to both applicant and Mr. Mackay if we could. Do we have, just help me if we could, do we actually have the wording of the proposed condition around cut and carry from the applicant? I know we have it somewhere. Do you at your fingertips where it is? The main question, did you actually propose it as a condition of consent or a condition that a consent notice would be imposed?
It would be for a consent notice.
Okay, so thank you. So in that case, the issue around enforcement changes a little bit, doesn't it? Because a consent notice is really to signal to those landowners that they need to continually comply with something rather than putting the onus on district council to enforce that as such. Like in the case of a no complaints one, it's not something they just, as we've just talked about, it's a signal that they need to not be complaining. So okay, so that's helpful. So it's actually the wording that we have somewhere is as a consent notice.
Yes.
Okay.
Or it could be inserted into, well, we intended it as a consent notice, but we would happily insert that requirement into that condition 49 if we needed
together
to.
As a one. Yep, thank you.
Which is,
If you could find reference to where that wording is for me, that would be very much appreciated.
Somewhere in here.
so I guess the main point of that is that each individual owner will be subject to that consent notice condition. It's obviously an enforceable condition by the council, but it's not enforceable against the applicant because it's not a section 224 condition.
Just in terms of the compliance side of things, we talked about the cumulative things and presumably over time. So if there is a compliance requirement from council, as the sections come online, that compliance requirement may not kick in for several years. It may not kick in for 10 years, where the cumulative effects start to be felt. So compliance issues are obligating council to do something potentially in 10 years' time when none of us around this table are here. And from a practical perspective, I just can't see how we can manage that. But there is an ongoing obligation that will be potentially in a new district plan as well. I don't have any other solution.
Can I ask a question? Was the Hawke's Regional Council one of the limited notified parties?
They actually weren't notified, but we were in consultation with the Hawke's Bay Regional Council around this issue with their consent staff and Paul Barrett, primarily, and Sophia Edmead. So when this issue came up, it was a recommendation from the Stantec peer reviewer on the Three Waters matters, who suggested that we should refer the application to Hawke's Bay Regional Council for comment, which we did. And that's when the Regional Council suggested that we would get advice from Paddle Dallimore, because that's whom they would use for similar type of advice. But the problem has been is that it's predicted that on an individual basis, the wastewater systems would likely comply with the relevant regional plan condition. Yeah, that's.
Well, should we ask Ms. Bowman?
Can you see them on your screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
We just, I don't know what you guys, you can probably just hear voices of people sitting at the table. Ms. Baum's on top.
One and
Ms. Luff on the
below. Hello. Yes,
Hello,
well,
ladies.
welcome to you both. Can you hear us all right?
Yes.
Good, good. We're not going to go through the business that we like a seance saying, can you hear me? Can you see me? You can see and hear each other. Lovely. Well, thank you to you both for making yourselves available. Before I ask any questions, can you confirm that you've read the Environment Court's practice note and can confirm that you will those requirements as expert witnesses?
Yes, I have read it and I agree.
Thank you very much. And what about you, Ms. Love?
Yes, I can confirm that too.
Thank you very much. Well, we have some questions to you. I don't know if you listened in yesterday when Dr. Cook spoke and gave us advice on his way of looking at the issues. We wanted you to come on board because obviously there's some slight, well, not misunderstanding, but obviously different points of view from, and it will help us to make some decisions if you can help provide more light to that. I think Commissioner Wilson would be the person probably to ask the questions mainly. That is correct?
Yes, probably. Just go for it. Yes, thank you both for being here. I think firstly, was there anything, I've got the memo from Ms. Baum dated 11 November 21 in front of me. So I've got a few kind of questions or things perhaps to talk about there. Was there anything that Professor Cook raised yesterday that you wanted to comment on in particular?
Yes. Well, morning, everyone. Sorry, just quickly, I'll try answer most of the questions, but Hilary is here just for any of the technical queries regarding treatment, and so I'll just defer those over to her if that's all right, just to have that known. And there are a few. So yeah, we had that original assessment that we provided in that circulated report, and since then we've done a looking at a few other things, including the issues around that cut and carry. So if it would be helpful, I have a bit of a summary that potentially I could go through, and that does address some of the queries raised by Professor Cook as well.
Please do, that sounds great, thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, that initial assessment, which is circulated, the overall, I guess, picture was that the effects from the proposed wastewater discharge were unlikely to increase from the current land use. However, that assessment was really done specifically regarding those potential effects and the potential cumulative effects. But as it's been raised, we've since had further discussions with Central Hawke's Bay about the ability to do cut and carry. And that's quite an important issue in terms of the nitrogen loading. And so we've had a relook at that scenario that we did assess, to have a look at what would change if cut and carry wasn't able to be, I guess, confirmed and know that it's actually happening. And so the outcome of that assessment was that the actual effects are still not actually likely to increase from the current land use. And that is based on the 200 litres per person per day, and that is allowing for up to 6 people per household. And I understand that Professor Cook raised that if you were not on a reticulated supply, that would reduce to 180, which we acknowledge, but I guess ours is that next level up in terms of the maximum allowable volume, just to cover all the bases off. However, in saying that the actual effects are not likely to increase, you really do want to raise that there is uncertainty in how the existing effects, the information available about what the current loading is. So we've used that farm management plan, and that's detailed in that original memo. We also acknowledge that there will be some denitrification in the soil, but we certainly don't think that will be enough to remove all the nitrogen if we're not assuming that cut and carry can be undertaken. And
could I just interrupt you for a point? Just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt your flow. The farm management plan, is there an existing farm plan for the property, or do you mean the framework that's used?
There was a farm environment management plan that was done in 2018, and I believe it was for part of the property that was leased by a neighbour.
Okay.
And so there is some uncertainty about how that was split across the blocks and how that relates specifically to the parcels we're looking at.
Okay, but it gave you some idea of the existing uses would be the primary reason for looking at that?
That's right. And they did do some overseer modelling, although we do note that was only for a year. And so there are some uncertainties regarding.
Sorry, can I just ask a follow-up? I was just going to ask about overseer. What version was used? Do you know? Or if you...
Yes, I do, 6.2.3. And you do understand the limitations associated with overseer in general. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. Thank you for that.
That's all right. And so, yeah, yes, with the assumption that cut and carry wasn't able to be undertaken, and assuming that all the nutrients are then recycled back into the soil. Yeah, relying on denitrification we don't think is appropriate, and we don't just want to rely, I guess, on the environment to be able to handle those loads, particularly because there are existing issues with increased elevations in surface water, and the groundwater has not reached beyond the drinking water standards as identified in that memo. But it is still there, and any increase is going to have an effect on the environment. And we also acknowledge, and this was discussed yesterday, that there is uncertainty and difficulty knowing about how these lots will be used. And so this assessment hasn't incorporated, if people have a few sheep or some grazing on some of the larger lots, and also fertilizers for gardens and things like that, which I think we covered yesterday. And so given those, we would really think it would be ideal and best practice to be able to lower the nutrient leaching potential as much as possible. And we understand yesterday those two systems that were discussed, the Austin Blue Water and Oasis Clear Water, if I haven't mixed those two names up. And they are both secondary treatment systems. And we think it would be really ideal if that was specifically mentioned in the condition. And so it currently says that there will be UV treatment and drip line, and generally with drip line you need secondary anyway, but to remove any ambiguity for the landowners, we think it would be appropriate to specify secondary treatment.
Thank you. I noted that actually myself, so that's helpful.
Cool. And the other is cut and carry really is a very efficient way to reduce the loading or to encourage uptake. With cut and carry, we'll clarify that it doesn't necessarily mean that the clippings need to be taken off site. They just need to be removed from the actual disposal area. And so there is movement to disperse it on other areas of the property away from the disposal area. And if there are follow-up questions on that, I might defer that one to Hilary. But just before we do that, and the other thing in terms of, so that's, I guess, the nitrogen side of things. And for phosphorus, we do acknowledge that with the allophanic soils that Professor Cook brought up yesterday, that there will be increased retention, which is excellent. However, I guess our concern is that over time, all soils will reach their capacity with phosphorus, which will then induce leaching into the groundwater. And while the topsoils and soils with a high phosphorus retention will be better at managing that in the long term and take longer, they will ultimately all allow phosphorus to break through at some point. And we don't, we want to keep in, I guess, for as long as possible to reduce that leaching potential. And that again is being able to reduce the potential level in the discharge, the concentration, by specifying that secondary treatment will be a real benefit. And as well as the reducing the loading to 2 mil for these soils where there is a low phosphorus retention, which is the Mangatuai. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong. And yesterday, Professor Cook identified that there could be potential salination issues around the salts not flushing through the soils. And I'm not a technical expert in wastewater discharge design. So I did seek some advice from a colleague who identified that that can be an issue. However, it can also be managed. And so his, I guess, priorities in terms of discharge were to make sure that it hydraulically functions and then to manage the nitrogen and the phosphorus levels. And then the third after that was the management of sodium levels in salt. And he provided a few options for how to manage that, which I thought I would bring up, but yeah, we'll probably defer to Hilary if there are some further questions about that.
Could we talk about what those options are, or because we need to we'll have to make a decision around that 2 mils versus 4 mils application rate. So I think it's probably helpful to explore that now.
Sure. So my understanding was that one of the ways to manage it would be to undertake periodic testing, which is soil testing for the exchangeable sodium percentage. And if a landowner identified that they were having issues, or they might identify that they have issues if the grass is dying or something like that without doing that testing, but they would be able to add something like lime to the area, which would, I guess, provide a bit more of a chemical balance to flush the salts out and to allow the disposal field to keep operating. And there are other issues in terms of changing the pH and things, but he also identified that you could add other things like gypsum, which are quite readily available. And then he said, in terms of the soil sampling, that it would be quite a rare occurrence. He said that he wasn't, it was his understanding that that wasn't a common issue in New Zealand disposal fields. And that 2 mil is quite a standard rate for low permeability soils. And so he said, while that it could happen, he thought the risk of that happening was low, and that if it did occur, that it could be managed.
Thank you. Do you have questions at the moment or no? Okay. I asked a question, Ms. Baum, you may have heard, I asked a question of Professor Cook yesterday around opportunities for monitoring, given that there is a regional council monitoring board in the vicinity, and whether, I asked a question of the applicant, whether a adaptive management type approach or something had been considered, which I understand it hasn't as such. And I see applicants council writing furiously. I suspect that there's probably a position in terms of scope and what we'll be making decisions on, but do note that the environmental effects of wastewater are very clearly a controlled activity, controlled matter. Ms. Baum, do you have any thoughts on that question around monitoring opportunities and conditions that could, give us an indication of, say, I don't know if you heard the proposal by the option that's on the table from the applicant around staging or phasing of the proposal in sort of 3 chunks, and whether there's any opportunity to do some monitoring to see that the wastewater systems are having effects within the envelope that is being kind of discussed and assessed here. Have you got any comments or thoughts on that?
Yes, so I did hear Professor Cook discussing that yesterday, and I do agree that it would be probably quite difficult to be able to confidently assess any changes to groundwater, particularly given the environment that it's in, and being on a fairly recent alluvial plain. There's probably a high likelihood that there are a lot of paleochannels or more permeable channels, which creates, I guess, different flow paths and things. And so the ability to actually put a monitoring board down to confidently capture that would be quite difficult. The ongoing monitoring that the Regional Council does in stream is quite well placed to be just downstream at Chesterman's Bridge, which is helpful for the stream. And the Hawke's Bay Regional Council bore is not, may not capture all the effects, just given its oblique kind of location to the subdivision area. We had thought that it would be a more practical solution to try and limit it at the source, to restrict the concentrations and loading going in rather than monitoring the effects afterwards. But I might just call on Hilary if that's all right, if she has any further comments on that.
Yeah, I think you've covered that, Ella, but we just felt that in terms of monitoring, I guess the scale of effects we're anticipating here are not too different from the agricultural land use. We do have that concern with phosphorus, but that could take a very long time to develop. So as Ella said, we're certainly in favour of managing the effects at the source, as opposed to relying on any monitoring to inform changes. So having secondary treatment, promoting cut and carry, recognising some of the limitations with monitoring and compliance for that. Yeah, that was our thinking around that.
Thank you, Ms. Luff. That's really helpful. I think that's all for me. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you both very much.
Yes, thank you both.
for making yourselves available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. You, Mr. Mackay.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. If we could move now to the issue of review sensitivity and propose condition 52. That's the last condition. The subdivision consent. So, yeah, firstly, if I can just comment on the agreed reading between the applicant and Mr. Apple. I've got no issues with getting to the first paragraph or the suggested amendments made to the first paragraph. And I would, well, first of all, because it says the property is located in a rural area where agricultural management practices such as, I mean, I'm confident that the term agricultural management practices would cover all manner of horticulture, agriculture, or viticulture. However, as was just being discussed before, in my view, one of the primary purposes of this type of no complaints covenant through a consent notice is actually the dissemination of information to future property purchasers. So in that regard, I think it would be helpful just to add more examples after the such as, and agree with Mr. Lawson that pastoral farming and cropping, would be helpful to add there. Obviously, within pastoral farming and cropping, there's a whole, another manner of a range of activities that occur that can create annoyance, but it just helps to give future purchasers a good understanding of the types of things that could be going on in the neighbourhood, so to speak. So I've got no problem with that aspect. I do have one concern, however, with the proposed wording versus what's recommended in condition 52, and that's in the final paragraph, the first words to it. So in the agreed condition from Mr. Apple, it starts with any complaint to a local authority. So you'll see that condition 52 quite deliberately doesn't actually mention the words any complaint to a local authority. In my opinion, it's not reasonable to do that because a local authority is obliged really to receive complaints from its community. So the actual wording in paragraph 52 that was offered by Mr. Kay, but in turn my understanding is it comes from the wording commonly used by Hastings District Council. As part of their right to farm policy, they've used this consent notice approach for many years now, and that wording has been reasonably carefully put together. I'll also note, to some extent, the term no complaints covenant is almost a misnomer, because a true covenant is actually, as you'll be aware, between two private parties. So in this case, it is a consent notice. In the context of Hastings, it's still referred to as a no complaints covenant, so that's fine. It's appropriate to call it that, except the expectation around no complaints. So when a no complaints covenant is between two parties, it can obviously be enforced by the dominant party, whatever the legal term is. So when it's used as a consent notice, the council is responsible for enforcing the condition on an ongoing basis. So in my view, and Mr. Lawson will be able to comment in his right of reply, I don't consider it appropriate to imply that a complaint can't be made to a local authority. In my view, the purpose of it is more to set out the expectations that this is a farming area. These are the type of things that are expected to happen in a farming area. Those things can cause nuisance. and then the wording that's there about shall not bring any proceedings for damages, negligence, nuisance, trespass, or interference arising from the use of that land. And then it goes on, any application, proceeding or appeal designed or intended to limit, prohibit, etc., the continued operations of any rural activity. So that's all wording from that standard no complaints consent notice that has been used in Hastings District for a number of years. But the problem with it, of course, is that for somebody to know whether a practice is being lawfully carried out, they would have to typically inquire of the council in the first instance. So whether that's an inquiry or a complaint, I guess, is a subtle point. So those are my thoughts on the no complaints covenant. So yeah, definitely supportive of the approach, and obviously have recommended what was offered by the applicant in condition 52. Certainly got no problem with the intent of the agreement with Mr. Apple, but just raising a concern about that specific wording at the start of the last paragraph.
Really, I'm just thinking out loud, really just, that submitters that we've had have gone away expecting to see that concept of a complaint, in the wording. But I take your point though, Phil, about, a council can't not receive a complaint. So I think it's just, going to have to be how it's presented back to the submitters with the revised wording. Yeah.
I think I did make sure that they realised that it wasn't
Final, yes, you did. Yeah.
But
yeah.
I understand, of course, submitters often, we all hear what we want to hear. Sometimes we don't hear the whole story. But yes, I think we'd have to obviously get back to them and tell them this is, that's what we're doing.
Madam Chair, just on that, and it might be a matter of clarification with Mr. Mackay, but what it's saying is the property owners shall not be and make a complaint, etc. Make a complaint. So it's not the fact that the local authority can't receive a complaint. They can't make a complaint about lawful activities. They can still complain if they think that, or ask the question if they think it's unlawful, or not covered by the code. And I hear, and I agree with that councils are there. You can't stop people making valid complaints. But what this is aimed at is stopping spurious ones. Yeah, that's the difference, I think. But I'll have a think about that wording as part of the response.
Does that wording has existing use rights allowances?
But part of the problem is that the last paragraph seems disjointed from the property owner or their successor in title shall not.
I think it's partly the layout and the changes, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just, there is just that inherent issue that definitely an appropriate condition and very important in terms of that information provision and due diligence for future owners coming to a rural area. But the technicalities of just how a complaint or an inquiry would be dealt with is a little bit less clear. Okay.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, would you like to break for morning tea, or would you like to continue?
Quite like a break for morning tea. I think we all probably. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me.
It's no problem at all.
just the issues around the lapse date, which I cover on pages 89 and 90 of the section 42A report. So when I was discussing the weighting of the objectives and policies of the proposed plan in relation to the subdivision as a whole, that those objectives and policies should only be given little weight because they don't change the status of the application. It remains a controlled activity. So even if the subdivision is contrary to the objectives and policies of the proposed plan, it's largely irrelevant in terms of the subdivision itself being a controlled activity because that status can't be overturned. But my, I guess, planning logic and making the assessment on the lapse date is that there should be given more weight in that decision simply because that's the planning framework will be in place when the subdivision is given effect to, even under a standard lapse date of 5 years. By the time the houses are built, it's actually the rules in the proposed plan that they'll be being built under. So if I understand from the applicant's point of view how the 15-year lapse date is practicable and reasonable for doing a 16-stage subdivision. But in terms of that conflict with the objectives and policies of the proposed plan, it is completely contrary in my opinion. So it does lead to the situation where houses will be still being built in 20 years' time when this current plan is long gone. I think in my opinion, this issue there is a important sort of legal and case law aspects to this, and Mr. Lawson's provided some case law references and given his view on that. So in writing that section of the report, did discuss it with council's legal advisors and talked to them again last night, so that they have offered to provide some written advice if it is of assistance to the panel, which would obviously need to be provided in time for Mr. Lawson to be able to refer to it in his right of reply. But they were happy to take well, if the panel seeks the advice, this is from Rice Spear, they'll endeavour to provide that with, in a time frame that you needed it by. So I think it is, or in my opinion, it is important. It's just, the case law is difficult because obviously comparing a land use consent to a subdivision consent, the two things are quite different, and especially in terms of a staged subdivision. And the status of a proposed district plan, if it should be given more weight in terms of a lapse date decision compared to the substantive decision on the subdivision. So it's essentially I stand by what I have in the section 42A report and recommend seeking that independent or the legal advice from council's advisors.
Thank you, Mr. Mackay.
So that's the lapse date. And just finally, on matters that have arisen during the hearing, but it's not really covered in my report. It's the issue of the need for the subdivision and the need for additional residential sections and building opportunities. And it wasn't covered because it's a controlled activity, so it didn't really need to be. And I'm not disputing anything that Ms. Elmer's referred to about there being difficulty in finding a victim when they were looking at that or for their daughter. But certainly in recent times, the situation has changed quite significantly. And Central Hawke's Bay District Council have been doing quite a lot of work in that area. And in answering your question, Madam Chair, they produced what was titled an Integrated Spatial Plan, which is the equivalent of HPADs, as part of the inputs to the proposed district plan. It does largely focus on the urban areas of Central Hawke's Bay. And Mr. Kay correctly pointed out that there are issues in terms of the infrastructure of the urban areas, and part of the purpose of that spatial plan is also to feed into the LTP and upgrading that infrastructure. So there has been this is not the integrated spatial plan that's available online, but a report has been produced recently. This one here, which will table demographic and economic growth projections update. So that's a document that is just fed into the recent information provided for the proposed district plan. The recent hearing was on residential growth.
And that's a publicly available document.
It's not a non-statutory.
It's a non-statutory document, that's correct, but it does make interesting reading generally. It's reasonably, it's over 20 pages. There's a couple of specific parts of it that are relevant to the matters that have been discussed here.
Just for context, that report was commissioned prior to LTP consultation. So prior to the first lockdown, we also adopted the high growth strategy as a result. And it was, this is the update following that post-COVID, and obviously just wanted to see what had happened through that. But yeah.
So that date is what, 20?
It's a 2022.
This is the 22 one, yeah, so it's much recent.
February 2022.
But there was a previous version from 2020.
2020, yes.
There being the original report. And so it documents the high growth rate or high population growth rate that Central Hawke's Bay District Council has had in the last several years, including comparing to neighbouring local authorities. It gives a good general commentary on economic conditions and industry and jobs and all sorts. But in terms of matters that might be specifically relevant, so if we table a copy, then I'll just give the references. So on the top of page 2, states a big jump in the number of lots being approved from subdivisions over the last 2 years. So the last 2 years being 2020, 2021, indicates that land availability is not going to be a constraint on population growth going forward. And then on page 11 of the report, there's a table 10, which provides information on building consents in the district for the year up to November 2021. And quite significant in terms of the number of building consents for new residential dwellings, particularly in the rural areas of the district, which reflects there has been a high rate of rural subdivision in the rural zone under the controlled activity rules. And in terms of, there was 108 new dwellings in 2021 112 in 2020 and 71 in 2019. And 57% of those were in the rural areas outside of Waipawa and Waipukaro.
Zoned rural or not? Or
Yeah.
That will include some township stuff
Yeah,
in there.
not that fine grain because of, that's right, that one of those figures would include Otani.
What was that percentage, Phil?
57%, but yeah, yeah. And yeah, finally, that just in terms of that's no 2021. Is it?
Yeah, so from a consenting perspective, we just with all our subdivision consents, we map them so we can look at where our growth is coming from regionally and house infrastructure particularly. But so from the January 21 till end of April 22. So that covers that period where the LTP was accepted and development contributions increased significantly. So we've had a massive influx of consents also around the same time when the district plan or proposed district plan was notified. So that had another run on consent. So it covers those two periods because they were unusual blips, but certainly drove some development. But in that, of the number, almost 75% of the consents received were for rural subdivision. And of the new lots created during that time and excluding the application for this subdivision, there was 1,136 new lots that would be created as a result of those subdivisions. And of those, the majority of them are in the rural areas. That also does include a couple of major residential ones, including an 89 lot down here in Waipawa, a 61 lot in Waipawa, and a number of smaller ones. And the other thing probably also just to note is in the spatial plan, we have got funding from the RMA for the first round of it, I should say, that back of the hospital site. So that whole area is designated for growth, and there's 750 to 1,200 houses estimated to be done through there in the next 10 years.
Those new lots, what are they, mainly residential size though? Or
Yes, they are. So yeah, majority, probably 99% of them would be.
sort of 1,000 square meters rather than.
And not the residential ones, they could go anything from 350 up to, that would include maybe up to 1,000 possibly. So that the townships of Watani, Takapau, Onga Tiko, a minimum lot size of 1,000. But the rural ones, which are a minimum lot size of 4,000, which is obviously related to this, the majority of them are in that space.
So just again, referring to the report, so that's page 20 of the report, and then there's just a one-page addendum that Robin's produced just to update the figures on page 20, but on page 20 it shows a graph with a huge jump in the number of lots created in the 20 to 2021 year.
So that graph is literally just I have to report to it each month to council, so it's published.
Madam Chair, that's everything that I wanted to cover on my report and what's come up in terms of the hearing. So I'm now happy to answer questions from the panel.
Nothing more that we've heard today or yesterday and today. We've covered everything you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I just wondered what I'm going to be asking Mr. Wilson about this too, really. Part 2 of the Act. You talk about it on page 91. And obviously, you believe that it's appropriate to go into great detail about it because of the not had anything to the evaluative exercise of this application. I still think that's so. There's no provisions in to part two rather that we should be looking at.
Yes. With the issue with part two in a controlled activity subdivision, of course, is regardless of the requirement to have regard to part two, even ahead of this Davidson case law, is that with the controlled activity, consent must be granted and conditions must be based on the matters of control restricted. So the only realistic relevance of referring to part two would be where a matter of control also related to a matter in part two, which in theory all of the matters of control should do, because they've been the strict plans have been prepared having regard to part two. So that's the basis for my conclusion.
I guess as commissioners, when we're going through the training, and I know you've gone through the course as well, it does talk about the filter of part two as being something we should be looking at, but that's why I'm seeking advice.
Yes.
Because it's controlled, you're saying, well, those issues have already been dealt with when preparing the plan.
Okay, thank you.
That helps me. Questions?
Just probably sort of related to that. I'm just looking at the notification report, or I guess in thinking about part two matters and the question I put to Mr. Kay yesterday around the approach in the application that doesn't have regard to the various regional planning instruments and the framework that applies. I'm just, I guess, and this is probably signaling to the applicant as well, I'm trying to frame this as a question. So the reason that the trust was notified, is that because of the statutory acknowledgement nearby, or is that?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Primarily, but because of the statutory acknowledgement of the stream being a tributary to the area that it applied.
Okay. Because the issue I guess I'm thinking about is, and I've seen it, I guess it's been coming up with in other jurisdictions where with controlled activities and restricted discretionary activities that don't, and older plans that don't include effects on tangata whenua as one of those matters. And my experience has been that, best practice approach has been to, I guess, accept that those other provisions of the Act, Section 6E, Section 8, kind of, they need to be considered as well, albeit we have these controlled and restricted discretionary rules.
Yes.
So this is I'm probably signaling this more to the applicant than anything that we may want to hear from you, Mr. Lawson, on this. I know Mr. Kay's comment that there was no consultation with tangata whenua prior to lodgement, and just want to signal that that's something, as Madam Chair said, that we need to turn our minds to in our decision.
Yeah, so that is, my understanding, Commissioner Wilson, also that there has been case law about where there are Section 6C matters that are relevant, and that is an occasion where it would be relevant to consider part two. I guess in this instance, because there was no signals or information suggesting that there's any Waitāpu archaeological sites or Waitonga in the area, that didn't come, that wasn't a leader to looking at F6C specifically, and then with the wider statutory acknowledgement and the limited notification providing the opportunity to comment on that. I'm happy that there was no need to give specific consideration to Section 6C in this case.
Did we want to address the issue around legal advice?
Yes, the question of legal advice, Mr. Mackay, that is an issue that we as commissioners have been thinking about, because there's very little assistance anywhere, really, is there? Obviously searched for background.
I must admit, found that quite challenging, the lapse date extension out of the application. Yeah, it is quite difficult to find that background on that.
So I think that, yeah, there's potentially two issues there. One is that lapse date, and then the other that we're thinking about is that weighting of the provisions, particularly given that in that wider planning context, I suppose we have a district plan that's some 20 years old and a regional plan that's 5 years that has been, you know, significantly, a huge amount of work has been going on, and it's very catchment specific and all of that. And so we've got a very big difference in those. So I'm not sure the reliance, and again, this is probably a signal to council for the applicant that the reliance on the Davidson approach is perhaps not as clear cut as is being promulgated. And I'm not signaling we've made that decision, but just that we are thinking about that. So whether there's opportunity, so you mentioned that council legal advisors could give some advice around the lapse date case law. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I believe we will probably
Yes, definitely.
request that.
Yeah, I think, if I can just comment on the regional planning provisions, probably one of the areas that, you know, with the Tuki plan change, relatively recent, even though it's a few years ago now, but of course the on-site wastewater rules weren't part of that.
Questions?
Look, I have some more specific questions, and they really, I guess, relate back to what we've heard from submitters yesterday and today, and really around, you know, an opportunity. I think a number of their concerns could have been addressed by, well, it's not too late now, but, you know, pre-hearing meetings, for example, but I still think that there's an opportunity to be able to do that. So this is as much directed to the applicant as to you, Mr. Mackay, but really things around the issue of fencing or boundary planting, you know, for the huts, and obviously Ms. Bell is some, you know, genuine concerns too about what's happening, and if something can be done there, that would be good. I think, you know, we're relying very much on that proposed consent condition, and I do think that that's going to address a lot of the issues, but I still think that there's an opportunity potentially for some other within the scope of the matters for control. Obviously, we're not going to talk about, you know, huge things, just to address some of those concerns. I don't know, do you have any comment on that?
I guess my comment is that most of the submitters on my reading of the submissions are fundamentally opposed to the development as a whole, and there's really nothing that can be done to appease that. You know, the sheer size and scale of the subdivision is what's been applied for. That would be my comment.
Okay. On that, Mr. Mackay, could you, I think it's a question to you. There was a meeting with neighbours, I believe. Was that? Could you tell us I don't know, I'm not clear on how that.
Yes, I need to defer to Ms. Burns on that.
There was some concerns raised by predominantly the submitters actually that you saw, that ended up speaking to councillors, and we ended up having an informal discussion around it that was facilitated by the council laws and council officers. I was there speaking to the application, and their concerns were around, as Mr. Mackay has just said, just around how could this happen, and obviously the proposed district plan had then been notified, so it was understanding their concerns, and out of that there was a number of concerns that we documented and we forwarded onto the applicants. So there were things in there around, we had people from the local fire service there. The water issue came up, everything that they have spoken about the last 2 days were all raised. And when these submissions came in with the same points, but they had obviously just thought about them a little bit further. So it was really just a community informal meeting where, to be perfectly honest, we expected to have 3 or 4 there, and it ended up, I think, being close to 20. It was quite a groundswell.
Was that in Omaronga?
No, it was here actually. We hosted in Chambers. It was very much community based. There was myself, chief executive, and I think 1 or 2 other council officers from the executive leadership team, and several of the councillors, and that was basically it. It was very much community led and facilitate and let them just have their say. And
Were the applicants invited to that, or?
no, they were not. Although I did phone, it was not appropriate, to be perfectly honest, and that they asked for the meeting, and we asked how it would, they wanted to run it, and they did not want the applicant there. But I did phone Mrs. Elmer's following, who know that had happened, and some of the key issues that had come out as a courtesy, because clearly there had also been, prior to that, to give some context, some pretty difficult stuff on Facebook, which was why council comms team jumped in, because the feeling from the community was starting to get very toxic, and we needed, and fairness to the applicant too, you know, they have rights in this process as well. So that meeting was there to try and dispel some of the myths, and you can imagine there were lots of urban myths going around on Facebook, as there often are.
Can I just ask, Mr. Mackay, you mentioned it was the scale and size of the subdivision. If it had been a smaller scale of size, say stage 1 only, do you think there would have been as much, would it have been easier perhaps to provide some ways of mitigating the concerns?
Yeah, I think so, because it's relatively common in Central Hawke's Bay District, you know, clusters of lifestyle sites being subdivided off farms. So that's not unusual. I guess I commented in the notification report about this being different to the normal run of applications. So potentially it would meet the special circumstances criteria. Yeah, no, well, you know, it's been commented on, you know, comparing the number of lots to the settlements and so forth in terms of the scale.
Aside from the issue of relating to the lat state, do you have any comment on the proposed staging of the phases in terms of their actual location? Because we heard quite a bit about, you know, this potential disturbance for 15 years. And, you know, is there any thought been given to how the staging itself might help mitigate that length of time, you know, for the neighbours? I don't know. If there's an order that's more neighbour friendly, I don't know.
The staging's relatively, well, in my opinion, the staging seems relatively logical, you know, for achieving the 16 stages. Also, as we heard from the applicant, there has been some logic applied to maintaining a farming balance in the meantime, with the farm buildings, etc., being in the later stages. I guess that the neighbours on Wakarara Road, the good thing there is that that's you know, the earlier stages are fronting Wakarara Road. Although by the same token, the entranceway is one off Wakarara Road and one off State Highway 50.
Thank you.
Sorry, just going back then to the proposal yesterday about phasing. Instead of using the word stage, I'll say the phases. And the first phase is the stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then it's 6 to 10. And then the third phase would be 11 to 16. Have you got any comment on that as a way of dealing with?
Yes, I have actually. And yes, sorry.
I'd made a note of it earlier and then.
That was one thing I did make a note to talk about, and sorry, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, so if you were minded to accept Mr. Lawson's staged approach, and I agree that that's much better than just a flat 15 years to complete. I like the idea of it having to be broken down into the stages 1 to 5 within the first 5 years, and so on. I guess one thing I'm not totally sure on, but would like, or think would be appropriate, is that the condition would need to specify that if stages 1 to 5 aren't given effect to in the 5 years, then the subdivision as a whole would lapse, just so there's no ambiguity that stages 6 to 10 could be picked up on and completed in 10 years, or stages 11 to 16 could be completed in 15 years. You need the same sort of wording to apply to the stages that need to be completed in the 10 years.
Can you just remind me to what happens if consent grant is granted and the lapse date comes along and they haven't given effect to it? They could reapply. Is that right? An applicant can reapply, yes, and because conditions have changed, situations changed.
You can apply for an extension of the lapse date. You cannot apply for an extension of the time to meet the section 224 conditions.
Right, that's that 3 year thing.
It's the 3 years. Yeah.
But the point is that obviously takes into account economic problems and weather problems and all COVID and anything else that might turn up, that people could apply to say, look, for these reasons, we haven't been able to start after all, or give enough activity to say we've been able to take. So there is always that provision there. Keep going.
Yeah, well, yes, it's section 125, the opportunity for state extension.
Thank you. Can you give us the actual wording? So I did start noting it down, but can you put something in writing about that possible lapse date condition? The way you said, I think, specify that 1 to 5 can't give effect, if not given effect to in the first 5 years, and you'd have to do it for the other 2 as well.
Yes.
Put something in writing and just share it with us and with
Yes.
the applicant.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. I think it would just help us when we're looking at conditions as an alternative. Thank you. Any other questions? Something. Mr. Lawson, is it all right if Ms. Wilson asks some questions of you? And
Yeah, absolutely.
okay? Just for what you've heard, it might help to.
Just one really, and it's of course at your discretion whether you address it or not, but whether on the basis of what you've heard from submitters and given the comments, very clear statements from Ms. Elmers about the intention to go ahead with phase 1, if we call it that, if we accept the phasing proposal, if there were any mitigation or we won't call them mitigation measures, if there were any design features, I suppose, that we're willing to be committed to now as part of that first phase. You know, we were talking about some plantings and the intention of the appearance and things like this. And if any of that were at a point that, again, given what you've heard from submitters, that it could be offered or talked about, at least in right of reply, please, I'm just making the invitation, and that's not framing it as a question as such, but
I'll obviously have to take instructions on and can address it in the right of reply, but the golden rule of any subdivision, and this is from a practical subdivision, is that the what happens on the first lots determines what the subdivision is going to look like, and your the sale of your last lots are dependent upon how well you do the first one. So it's in the interest to make sure of the applicant to make sure that that it is an attractive proposition for everyone in the subdivision. But I can expand on that and see what commitments can be given in terms of how that's going to be rolled out on a voluntary basis by the applicant.
Very much.
No, thank you.
Well, it looks so we can go through to right of reply, but as we discussed yesterday, Mr. Lawson, would you prefer to have some time?
Well, I'm going to need to
you're
wait.
going to need
The rice beers. I'll wait with bated breath for the advice and on those issues. What I thought could be quite helpful is for me to go through the issues that I've noted that need some addressing in the right of reply, and I'm happy for you to indicate whether there are any additional matters.
Thank you. Appreciate you doing that.
So the issues that I see arising from submissions and from this hearing process is really nailing down the no complaints covenant, and in terms of the right of reply, the intent of that is to make sure that lawfully established and lawfully undertaken farming rural activities are not impeded in any way, shape or form by this development. And I was just discussing with Mr. Kay the issue that Mr. Mackay has raised about everyone's entitled to make a complaint to the local authority, and that's absolutely correct. What we're trying to achieve through the no complaints covenant is essentially a filter whereby it's to filter out spurious complaints. If there's an activity that has been undertaken unlawfully, then the no complaints covenant doesn't prohibit anyone from taking an action or making a complaint. If it's been undertaken lawfully, then the district council is the gatekeeper, if you like, and says, well, that's a lawful activity, go away. And hopefully, that's effectively how they tend to work, but it doesn't stop anyone from making a complaint about an illegal activity. So it's about getting that balance, just to make sure that people know that complaining about a tractor at night is not going to get any sympathy from the regional council, from district council. But we won't get any sympathy from the regional council either, on any front. The second, and these are in no particular order, but the second issue that I've noted is the potential for commercial activities or setting aside some part of the subdivision for a shop or some other commercial activity, or even if the school needs to be expanded. That hasn't been included as part of the subdivision, because if that was included, it would take it outside of being a controlled activity. But those options do exist, and with the sort of vibrant community that is going to be possible with the subdivision, there is the potential for that to happen at a later date. So there's nothing that rules it out, and it's not intended that commercial activities are going to be restricted by way of land covenant, etc. But they would have to meet the district plan requirements in that process. I think, and I'll tackle this head on Commissioner Wilson that I'm going to be addressing the issue of jurisdiction and the delineation of that jurisdiction in relation to the wastewater discharges. While there is a role of district councils in ensuring integrated management of subdivisions and the like, it doesn't go cross over into the regional council jurisdiction in relation to managing and monitoring of discharge regimes, and you know the rationale for that is obvious, that that there's one body that is charged with that. So that's something that I will be addressing, and in particular issues around Te Mana Otuai and the NES freshwater management. This isn't a discharge to, this is a discharge to land. It's not a discharge of wastewater to freshwater. And but again, those are all matters that need to be addressed and with the regional council in their planning framework. And when we look at the matters of control under the district plan, the matters for control are: is it feasible that there is an on-site wastewater system available for this development? And the answer is yes. And I note Boehm's statement today that the discharge is likely to be less, and Professor Cook had it significantly less than the current existing farming land use. So that is a matter that a jurisdictional issue that I'll be addressing.
Just quickly, Mr. Lawson, if I could, Mr. McKay might want to clarify. I'm not incorrect that the environmental effects of the sanitary wastewater system proposed as a matter of control. I believe it's listed.
That's right, to defer to the actual wording.
The rule is 9.9.3H. So it's the method of sewage disposal where a public reticulation and treatment system is not available.
And the location and environmental effects of the proposed sanitary sewage system. I'm reading from your submissions, page 9, para H, 28H.
That's in relation to a sanitary sewage system as a reticulated disposal system, not an on-site wastewater system.
Sure that that's how that rule reads. You may wish to address that. Thank you.
I can address that. The next thing is the issue around the duration of the National Environmental Standard and the lapsing date for that, and whether or not, given that is an issue that arises in the later stages, whether or not there can be some certification of the RAP type process at a later date, and how that's incorporated into the conditions of that. Footpaths and street lighting. I'm not sure that there's well certainly the footpath is part of the proposal, and I'm not sure that that there is a substantial difference between between what has been proposed as a category F or G. I can't remember what the letter was. Category P lighting system, and what's been proposed by the applicant, and we'll address that as part of the any difference in opinion as part of the right of reply. Someone's raised the issue of 600 dogs on the site. Not a matter of control. There are bylaws, Dog Control Act, etc. So I think it's best that we address those issues with the appropriate regulatory framework. Certainly, just going back to the street lighting, I think that the approach that's taken in the conditions of making the design of street lighting part of the engineering design process is sensible. At the end of the day, it's largely it's an engineering road safety type issue, and I think that's a matter of detailed design as to what it looks like. There is one issue that I will address in the right of reply, in a matter raised by Mr. Mackay, and that is the contention that that this proposal is completely contrary to the objectives and policies of the district plan. But even under the proposed district plan, even under the proposed district plan, this subdivision would still only be a discretionary activity. And again, case law saying that discretionary activities are generally acceptable within a zone, but not on every site. So the contrary to, I think, is perhaps overstating it, but it certainly isn't borne out by the discretionary status. I think Mr. Mackay is dead right in his reference to the Davidson case. And of course that was a case that where the Court of Appeal clarified the Supreme Court's judgment in the King Salmon case. And the Davidson approach has been consistently applied ever since. So it's not a situation where subsequent planning documents have either expressly or impliedly, nor could it override the approach of an R.J. Davidson. So putting aside the fact that it's a controlled activity, which puts in some context any reference to stage to part 2, the Davidson approach is really, it's a move away, and Madam Chair, you referred to doing the course where the part 2 reference was sort of seen as a filter where you stood back and said, well, does this actually achieve the purpose of the Act? And the Supreme Court said that overall broad judgment approach of referring to and applying part 2 is not appropriate for plans that have been promulgated having regard to part 2. I used to like the overall broad judgment approach. I thought it made better decisions and more focused decisions, but it's been ruled out by the Supreme Court. And then Davidson put a gloss on the King Salmon case by saying, well, it's really only in the case of ambiguity or irrationality, etc., that you'd have regard to part 2. And again, in the case of the context of a controlled activity consent, I don't think that part 2 regard to part 2 is necessary. So I agree with Mr. Mackay and his approach. Those are really the issues that I've identified and quickly going through my my notes. If there are any others, I'm happy to receive them now, or if there's anything specific to receive a communication to that effect. I think that the substantial agreement with Mr. Mackay's analysis and the conditions of consent, albeit with a tweaking of the lapse period, indicates that there's quite a considerable degree of agreement between us and council as to appropriate conditions of consent. So unless I can, or unless there are any other matters that you want me to specifically address, I will defer everything else to my written submissions. I'm just wondering, is there a time frame for the rice fairs?
I haven't even started that one, right?
Or as indicated, they could get it back to us in a week if required.
We'll give you 2 weeks then.
That's fine, thank you.
So it's on the assumption that we get that one in a week.
Perhaps if
So a week from receipt of
Receipt,
receipt of
yes,
rice
that's what I'm saying.
fairs.
So I think that I'd made some notes. I think a week away on the Friday would be 27th of May, and a week after that would be the 3rd of June. So I guess it puts us into some time in June, doesn't it? Early June.
I'm still waiting for some advice so that Laura said she'd have to us within a week, and that was 3 months ago. So
Well,
as soon as possible, but
yes,
just tie our time frame for a week after.
after you get it, after it arrives. Okay.
Madam Chair, can I ask one more question? And it's just because I'm going back through my notes, it's not for your right of reply. It's just Leanne Hutt talked about no caravans, tents, and only single-storey houses. So the question is, are you proposing to have building covenants on the lots?
The norm is for when I say the norm, our invariable practice acting for developers is to have simple and effective land covenants, such as no caravans, being used for occupation, permanent occupation. There's a difference between having a caravan parked in a garage and having someone living in it, because that sets the tone for the development. So I would envisage there will be land covenants as part of the subdivision process. My advice is always to address the things that matter. There's a certain development in Ferry Road in Clive that restricts your lawn being longer than 50 millimetres long. And believe it or not, people try to enforce it with a 25, and the punishment or the penalty is a $25,000 fine. So we've had various neighbours trying to enforce $25,000 fine because they're out there measuring I don't like that sort of. I don't favour that sort of approach, but things that go to the maintaining the quality and the character of the development. I think the reference to single-storey dwellings, that I think is going too far on a 4,000 square metre section in terms of being able to justify that. I just don't believe that's an appropriate thing. So
thank you.
I can just make a comment in passing. Mr. Lawson, I have a daughter and a family who live in Switzerland, And on one occasion, my husband and I were visiting, and my husband, being sort of handyman that he is, went out there to do some work in the garden. And at some point, Helen came out and said, "Dad, you've got to stop." And he said, "Well, why? It's still light." "No, you've got to stop because the neighbours can complain if you keep working outside after whatever time it was," which of course was still sunny. You know, we thought, so I know exactly what you mean. There are some places in the world, and she didn't think the neighbours would really complain, but didn't want to be in a situation where they could complain. So she was.
My sister lives in Germany, and their wood pile, the wood has to be stacked in particular dimensions, and each piece of wood is not allowed to be longer than about 8 inches long.
I quite like that one. I like the wood file.
Okay.
Tell the people in Clive, they might.
Come and measure it.
So those covenants, though, nothing, because those come later, and so there's nothing we can.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I just make a comment here? Is that all right? Have you finished?
Yeah, fire.
Yes, certainly we will allow you to
You want me
make a
to?
comment. No, it's all right. I think it's good.
Right, well, right from the very beginning, feel free to sit down, when we decided to proceed with this, we looked at all the rules and regulations, and of course, I'm not a planner, so we obviously took advice. And the brief was to work within the current district plan, but to make a beautiful environment for people to live in. Hence the mixture of lots and a lower density. We're going to be living there, and we lived in the subdivision that we did in Gisborne, so we have a vested interest in what it's like. We're farmers, we're not big Auckland developers or Queenstown developers. We're very aware of the needs for both the new residents and the existing residents to get on and to live in a pleasant environment. Now, we put quite strict covenants on the subdivision that we did at One Beach in Gisborne. A lot of people didn't like them, but contrary to what Matthew said, having a penalty does really make them listen. And we, out of the 69 lots, we only had 3 occasions to, which was my job, write to people building homes or that had built about. We had a covenant, no front fences, because we felt it was dangerous backing out of driveways for children using the footpaths and things like that. And a couple of people insisted on having a front fence. So it took about 3 letters and the threat of the covenant that this will be legally enforced if you don't do it. So the fences were duly pulled out. We had another one about caravan. We had a covenant that said that, of course, no one was to live in a caravan or a temporary dwelling. No decrepit or unused machinery was allowed to be stored on the lots. If they had a caravan, it was pretty screened from street view, all those sorts of things. We thought long and hard about animal covenants because people are very protective of their animals, but we felt in this instance that we would have 3 very strict covenants: no piggeries, no catteries, and no dog kennels. So that will take out any commercial aspect for people that, like one of the submitters who has 7 dogs, it might be appropriate where she is living, but as there will be more condensed. It is very deceiving. It looks like a residential subdivision, but when you actually, the reality of it is that it isn't. But still, barking dogs can be a very big detractor from neighbours, and we're going to have a maximum of 2 dogs per property. So there will be quite strict covenants there. With regard to it was briefly brought up about the planters. Now, we are the planters from hell. My husband and I have planted tens of thousands of native trees on properties we own. There was a little bit of a problem with this because the stream ownership, well, the ownership of the lots bounding the stream is in the middle of the stream. So it sort of made it a little bit difficult, but we're thinking we can possibly get around that with covenants, and either require them to fence it off, but if we don't do that, we will put some sort of covenant in that the stream surround, or the backing parts of the land backing onto the stream, we would like to see a corridor there. But it's a little bit difficult. We're just trying to work a way around that we can do that. And we also usually do a lot of boundary plantings, but with this particular area of land, one of the most attractive aspects of it is, and you wouldn't have been able to view it when you inspected it the other day, is the spectacular view of the Ruahine Mountains. And they're just world class. The view is just amazing. We lived right on the side, just further up the road, up Wakara. We live 20 k's up there. And it's absolutely stunningly beautiful. And we're trying to work around a way that we can preserve view shafts without saying we want to limit the use of shelter belts and go possibly for hedges with a maximum of 3 metres, so that the person behind and beside can actually see over top, because the land slightly raises up about 12 metres from the front onto the highway to the back. So because of that natural geography of the land, you are going to get quite a good vision, even if a neighbour does put a 3 metre hedge there. But we've already started on a program of every year we'll be planting a large number of deciduous trees. And the reason for that is that native trees do, as Jason pointed out, require substantial watering to get them established. And if we were to go and plant blocks of natives on the boundaries now, they would probably all fail. So what we're doing is planting deciduous trees, and we're putting protection around them, and they will give an ambience to the whole area. And we will have covenants about non-removal of those. We are very environmentally minded, and we do we are trying to address any concerns. And because we're farmers, there is no way that we want. We'll try and make sure that people do treat it like a country area. And I think we will try and give them a little pamphlet saying you are moving into a country area, and please be aware that the wider environment is there for your enjoyment, but it also has to be respected. And there's a couple of other things. Just because this, I think, has been a shock because of the size of the number of proposed sections or lots. But just because it's not expected or not the norm, it doesn't mean that it's bad or that it won't work. I think we need to be a lot more positive. I mean, going back in the early days, Mr. Bridge was one of the early pioneers, and he, I think, set up the Onga Township. And I'm sure in those days, probably the surrounding farmers said, we don't want those people here, and blah, blah, blah. But it's been proven there is a definite need. People are emptying out worldwide, are emptying out of the cities. They are very content working from home. People, a certain planner in this room said how unpleasant it was trying to bring up children on a small 350 or 400 metre lot, particularly if you've got active little children that like getting out and about and exerting energy. And so the city model really does not suit a lot of people. And throughout the country, there has been a move to protect highly productive land. Well, that piece of land is not highly productive, and it never has been. And that's why it has been very minimally grazed, because it doesn't have any water. It will probably never be able to get irrigated. So its uses are very limited and its yield is very low. So all in all, if there's to be a prescription for a more intensive rural development, that land probably fits it as well as any land in the whole of the Hiratonga Plains would, because it's not what we call highly productive. But I think I'm pretty nervous about the attempt to not allow to extend the lapse date, because I think governments and councils have been caught with their literally with their pants down over this housing issue. There's a world housing crisis, as I mentioned before, working remotely, except for the cost of housing in cities worldwide has jumped up so high that most of our kids can't afford to live in a city anymore. And so there has been a general emptying out into rural areas, and this probably could not have been foreseen, giving the council due, well, you know, I mean, they probably should have zoned it in case it did happen. But there has been throughout New Zealand a general lack of zoning or approval. A lot of applications have even been turned down in areas because they didn't foresee the growth. But it's here, and councils and the government have been very short, hence this housing crisis. And I think by limiting it, I would very much like to see an open period of 15 years, because there are a few mitigating circumstances that I feel. Robin pointed out that there have been 1,200 rural lots recently established. Is that correct, Robin?
Not quite, but large numbers, yes.
Okay, large numbers. Now, this has come about, I guess, because numerous farmers thought, oh, well, you know, they may change or possibly going to change, so we'll apply. Now, probably quite a few of those won't eventuate, or they may get title to them, but they might decide not to sell them. But that has actually caused, or could cause, an oversupply from now that wasn't there 2 years ago. 2 years ago, you could not buy one, but right now there is an excess. And I think developing the first 5 stages would be probably in excess of 100 lots. It's also going to include the construction of quite an expensive bridge over that creek. We personally did not see the need to have a bridge over there, because we felt, being a rural subdivision, it wasn't entirely necessary for the stages fronting onto Wakarara to have a bridge, because we felt they had the Wakarara Road for access, and the main access to the subsequent stages is only around the corner. But if we do have to proceed and do that bridge, it's going to be a high cost item. And if, because of the large numbers of lots that have either come on or in the pipeline to coming on now, you know, it's quite a big ask to just say, bang, that's it, you know, 5 years, it has to be done, because the implications of, well, for instance, if we had to rush ahead and get 100 titles, that means we have to fund all the roading ahead of perhaps where it's needed. You also get title, and if we had to pay rates on 50 lots, if the uptake was slower at the beginning, or if there was a recession, like now there's a bit of an excess of supply, there could be a recession. So it could mean, as developers all over New Zealand notoriously go broke, because they get stuck in this quandary of changing economic conditions. It's not because what they've done is wrong or it's early, but it's just that the economic circumstances have changed out of their control. So developers traditionally fall over like flies during a recession. We don't want that to happen, because there is a need. There is going to be a long-term need. And I can't see if we were limited by the stages proposed by Matthew, it would mean that possibly we're in a situation of having to apply for a lot of titles, and then we're going to have to pay the rates on those titles for possibly a very long time, which could amount to hundreds of thousands every year. And that could cause the development to fail. I'm only saying this if there were adverse economic effects after COVID. And I think worldwide, we're all expecting that this is probably going to happen. But that one thing is for sure, the housing crisis is not going to go away. It's becoming more serious as time goes on. And I think you said, didn't you, there's 1,600 houses short in Hastings. How many short in Napier? Similar number. So we're looking at 3,000 housing shortage in an area that is only 40 to 45 minutes drive away from us. And we were talking about carbon was mentioned by one of the submitters. And it's sort of the reverse of what they were implying, because so many people are travelling from Napier to work in these outlying areas, both on orchards and all the trades. If any work is going to be done, they're travelling long distances. So if those people are prepared to travel, a certain percentage of those people would be prepared to relocate here. We just don't, I would like you to try and keep an open mind that we think it's going to be a wonderful place to live. We think that the local people will enjoy feeling more of a community. Garth and I, at our age, we used to drive 20 miles down Wakarara Road, and then we'd drive another 8 to the pub. And we'd make sure we did it once every 2 weeks so that we can meet the locals. And that is the only place that you can meet the locals. And I think the advantages of having more young families, because I would say they will predominantly be young families, although Mr. Elder, the father of the submitter yesterday, he said that he and his wife have both got an elderly sister whose husbands have passed away, and they are thinking that they want to come and live in Hawke's Bay. And they said, well, we'd love it if it was just a section, but we are considering it, even though it's a larger block than we need. So there are situations like that. Farmers retire, their kids come back from university or overseas. They love the area, they're committed to it. They don't want to live in a 300 or 400 square metre section. They want the opportunity of perhaps living where they were brought up. And I just think, try and have an open mind that this will go some way to meet a need. And I just hope that if it is approved, you can drive past in a few years and say, well, we were a part of that, and hasn't it turned out beautifully?
Thank you very much, Ms. Arnold. We do have open minds, I must say. We've had a lot of things to listen to, think about, read, and we'll be going off and doing a little bit more, a lot more of that in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. So, the end of our hearing, isn't it? Nothing else?
Can I just clarify, if I may? There was just we talked earlier, the submitters just around passing some feedback back around that proposed no complaints covenant.
Yes.
Would it be appropriate for us to send an email out and just to collate that, and then ask them to get the feedback back?
Explain to them it is,
if proposed, but if there was anything they would like further consideration on, okay. So if we can provide that, maybe Jana, just by mid next week, so we can put it on.
Thank you for reminding me about that. Thank you. Right, Mr. Lawson, have you got any other concerns?
No concerns at all. I'm just I'll do my right of reply, and when we get that advice, we'll feed that in, respond to that.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you all of you for your attendance. It's been a very interesting hearing, and it's been quite exhausting as well, because we've had a lot of things to think about and listen to. But it's been very, very useful, I'm sure, for everyone. Thank you for the staff for their they've looked after us so well. We'll hear from each other in the near future. Thank you.
Coming to you.
Oh, thank you.
Early, but thank you.
Yeah, we've got them. Thank you.
Plenty to read.
They probably don't. Need to shut up.
Don't think
That's all right. Yeah.
very easily, isn't it?
Yeah. Woke up midway through the night thinking about something on it. It's been in my ear.
Let's talk. Everyone's also got this from Mr. Mackay, have they?
It's on the lighting.
Yeah, Campbell's. Never shared it with you. Thank you.
Would you mind emailing a copy of your submission code? Maybe we just need to pop it in. I've got a copy, but I've written all over it. It needs to go on. Thank you.
Problem with some documents, isn't it? If you write all over them.
I know, I
need
need
to
to-
share them with somebody.
I've got a clean copy.
Don't look at the bag.
I've got a clean copy.
Oh, that's fine. I'll scan it. It's fine.
Yeah, along with.